Hello and welcome back to another episode of Mr. Walker's Apes. Today we're going to just do a brief review of evolution and talk a tiny bit about biodiversity. The reason for this is just so that you have a good firm basis for how species come to be, and where they, how we're able to survive, really, even though the Earth is constantly in change, either naturally or because of humans. Okay, so the first thing is, if the world is constantly changing temperature, nutrients cycling through the Earth's ecosystem, etc., how in the world is there still life on Earth? And I think this is something that people have thought about for a very long time. And they said, well, heck, all these earthquakes and volcanoes and, temperature swings and things, and yet there is still life on Earth. Well, the answer is quite simply evolution. Okay? Without evolution, there would not be life on Earth. You must adapt and change in order to survive. So, without those changes, yes, there would not be life on Earth. Different organisms have different vulnerabilities. So, for example, humans are very vulnerable to cold. Okay, if we are any colder than about 45 degrees Fahrenheit constantly, we will get hypothermic and die. And that's really not that cold. Okay, that's not even freezing. So, you really, we've adapted by using our brains, which we have evolved over time, to make clothing that allows us to survive in those areas. Okay, so without the adaptation and evolution of our brains, that would not have happened. Other animals will respond differently. Okay, some will develop very thick fur coats in response to the cold. Well, okay, that's great and all, but then that excludes them from warmer areas. So, some things to keep in mind. And then, of course, change occurs on the geologic timescale, not the immediate timescale. In other words, you're not going to see evolution occur in your lifetime, even for short-lived species. Okay, we've been able to see some differentiation among insects because they have very short lifespans over lifetimes, but for most things, we're talking thousands to tens of thousands to millions of years to change. So how do we know that things have changed over time? Well, the fossil record. Okay, fossils, as you may know, are petrified or mineralized skeletons. So if an animal died thousands of years ago, its bones are no longer there. We're not finding bones. Those would have been destroyed. Instead, we're finding the mineralized leftovers. In other words, the bone went away, and what happened was that a different type of rock filled into the cavity where the bone was. And so we see basically a cast of the original bone that was there. However, not everything can change. Because of the fossil record, we estimate that 99% of all life that was on Earth is now extinct. Only 1% have evolved and changed enough to allow them to continue to survive, which is pretty astonishing. You also have to remember that there have been 6 mega extinctions. Okay, I don't think that's the proper term, but 6 mass extinctions, that's the word, in the course of the Earth that we know of, the dinosaurs being one of those mass extinctions, and there were a couple before that. So, we've changed quite a bit over the 4.5 billion years that the Earth has been here. So, even though we estimate that 99% of all organisms are gone, we also estimate that we have only collected about 1% of all the species that have ever lived. Seems about every year or so, scientists announce that they have found a new fossil for a dinosaur, and that's just because people care about dinosaurs that it makes the news. But they find fossils of new apes and new sloths and new lions and tigers and mammoths and things all over the place, and it really redefines what we think of in terms of species distribution and evolution all the time. So how do we change? How do we adapt? How do we do things? A little bit of biological refreshment here. Every cell in your body has DNA. Every single life form that we know of on Earth has some sort of genetic code. So either it's DNA or RNA or some strange thing like that. So the DNA codes for proteins. Those proteins do things for us. Okay, everything in your body has a protein to do it. If it doesn't have a protein, you don't do it. In fact, if you don't have some proteins, then that means that maybe you can't digest something, like you're lactose intolerant because you lack the gene for the enzyme that breaks down lactose. It could be that you have a disease. It could be that you don't develop skin pigment, so you're albino. All those sorts of things. So having these codes is very important. And these codes change over time through mutation, primarily. And when they mutate, we develop a new protein. Sometimes that protein is advantageous. Most of the time, it either has no effect or is harmful. So how do we know which ones will live, which ones will die? Okay. Well, you've got genetic variation. Even within the same species, you're going to have some variation. We can see that within any classroom in the school. Okay, you've got some blonde hair, some brown hair, some dark skin, some light skin, some with, various things, some tall, some short, etc. Okay, all that is based on genetics, which you get from your parents, and so we are all a little bit different. Even siblings are a little bit different. We're not exactly the same. So within a species, you've got variation. That total variation altogether creates what we call the gene pool. Okay, this is the sum of all potential genes. Okay, or in other words, those little codes that code for proteins within the population. So the human gene pool has genes for blonde hair, for dark skin, for light skin, for dark hair, for dark eyes, for blue eyes, for short, for tall, all these things. We have this giant gene pool to pull from because we have so many individuals. Okay? Whereas if you look at a smaller population, like maybe the bald eagle, okay, which are no longer endangered, but they were, then they have a relatively small gene pool just because they don't have very many individuals. Okay, and then finally, some individuals will reproduce more than others, so their traits are passed on, their genes are passed on, more so than others. So, this leads to natural selection. In order for natural selection to occur, there must be a variability within a trait. So, if I want to have some type of natural selection, then I'm going to select for the trait that is best suited for survival. If we look at humans, and we look at why do we have dark hair and why do we have light hair individuals within the human species? Well, that's because it depends on the part of the world that you came from many thousands of years ago, when natural selection still affected people. If you have dark hair, then you probably you have a background somewhere from Southern Europe or Africa or the Middle East. Okay? The reason for that is that you have more sunlight on those areas. And by having darker hair, it protected you from the sun so that you were less likely to get cancer and die. So you were able to pass on your genes. However, if you have lighter hair, then you're from a Nordic region, meaning you're probably from Sweden or Norway or Northern Europe. And the reason there is because, again, you don't have as much sun, so you're not going to get skin cancer and die. But also, if you have dark hair, then you don't get enough sunlight hitting you. And sunlight hitting you is important because you have to use the sun to make vitamin D. Now we add vitamin D to all our foods, and we have sunscreen and all these things, so this doesn't matter anymore. We are no longer naturally selecting for hair color. We might artificially select for it, but we're not naturally selecting for it, whereas in the past we would. So you have some variability which would select for the one that is best. Okay. It also must be heritable. If you have a trait that you cannot pass on, then that doesn't do us any good. Alright, let's look at a fictionalization here, because I don't know of any traits in reality that are not heritable, but I'm sure there are some. Let's look at, like, Spider-Man. Okay, Spider-Man got bitten by a spider and now he has superpowers. Well, I doubt that he can pass on those superpowers to his kid, because that's probably not the way it works. So therefore, there will only be one Spider-Man, even though those traits of super strength and being able to cling to walls and things would probably be advantageous for humans. It's probably not heritable, so it doesn't matter. And the trait must lead to differential reproduction. In other words, the trait must be favorable to mates as well. So, if I have a trait that gives me a third arm, but that arm is sticking out of my back, it would probably be advantageous to have a third arm because, you could get more work done and all these other things. The problem would be that it probably would not be attractive, and thus would not lead to me having more kids, and so it would not matter. Okay? So that's kind of what we're talking about there. And here's an example of some natural selection. Giraffes. Alright? So here we go. So you can see we're going from left to right on our timeline. We have some individuals with long necks, some with short necks. Okay? Those with longer necks can reach the tree easiest and get more food, and thus are more likely to survive. Those with shorter necks can't reach the tree, and so will probably not survive. So over time, those with long necks survive, and those with short necks die. And then that's how we end up with all giraffes having long necks. And this allowed them to get food. Now, of course, there were other pressures going on. Like, I'm sure there were other animals that came and ate off of these trees, which probably is why they had to get to the higher and higher leaves. So now they've filled their niche, and they get the high leaves along with elephants. Okay? And then other things will get the low leaves and the grasses. So, evolution. Just to summarize, it's the change in a population's genetic makeup through successive generations. It occurs by natural selection, which is the choosing of the traits which lead to the most offspring. And the theory of evolution states that all species descended from an earlier ancestral species. So at one point, there was, for humans, for all mammals really, when you go to the Museum of Natural History down in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian, they have this wonderful display that explains how we got from this little mouse-like creature that existed when the dinosaurs did to all the different mammals we have today. And it just so happens that that little mouse thing was perfectly suited to survive because the dinosaurs were so big they couldn't catch it and eat it, and it also lived in little tiny holes, they believe, and that's what allowed it to survive the catastrophe that hit, and it was a scavenger, so it ate all the dead stuff that came after the mass extinction. So, a little bit more detail, microevolution versus macroevolution. So mostly what I've been talking about up to this point is macroevolution, things that happen over a very long time. There is microevolution, and this is what happens when things change over a short period of time, generally through shuffling of alleles. Alleles are traits. Okay? This is most common in bacteria. So we can see within a petri dish over the course of a week, we can see microevolution if we introduce a stress, such as an antibiotic. You'll see those that will survive and those that will not, thus creating a new generation of bacteria that can survive better than the previous. Generally through mutations or other changes in DNA. When the trait allows the organism to survive better than its adaptation, and we call it an adaptive trait. So some examples of adaptations and adaptive traits. Okay, if we have an antibiotic factor, in this case cold, Okay, I had this kind of example at the beginning. If you have heavy fur, like the musk ox in Russia, they can survive extreme cold very easily because they have developed over time the ability to grow very thick, heavy fur. Birds fly south, okay? They get away from the cold. They have that option. Hibernation, okay, if we just live in the ground and sleep it off in a little nest, sleep through the cold, we'll be fine. Plants have a very similar adaptation, okay? Either if it's deciduous, they'll drop their leaves so that the leaves do not freeze and they don't get frostbitten, or they just develop pine needles, which can survive the cold. And then bulbs for things like tulips. All right, these are plants that will survive year after year because they just leave the bulbs in the ground, and then the bulbs sprout the next year. If we're looking at obtaining food, okay, we've got the giraffe example. We've also got examples of things like the anteater here. Anteater has developed a very long nose and tongue so that it can get the ants way deep into the ant. Frogs have their tongues. Okay, when we look at plants, they've developed either specialized leaves that get more light than others, or their roots. They develop more root hairs and things that are better at getting water and nutrients so that they can outcompete their neighbors. So they're all adaptations, and we've got even more adaptations. There are all sorts of things, okay? Everything from finding a mate to being able to survive. Obviously, survival is number one, but finding a mate is also just as important. If you don't continue to have babies, your species will cease to exist. So, survive and attract a mate. Those are your two big factors in determining evolution. Okay. So, when conditions change, what happens to the organisms? Right? 2 or 3 sentences explaining to me what would happen. Pick one of these conditions. Either continental drift, so continents are going to move apart, a gradual climate change, like scientists believe we're undergoing now, or a rapid climate change, which scientists believe will undergo in the future, in about 100 years. Maybe a catastrophic event, like a giant meteor hits the Earth, or something of that sort. What will happen to the organisms? Write out 2 or 3 sentences to tell me what will happen and why. Okay. So there are a couple of options here. Either the species will evolve, it will change locations, or it will become extinct. Okay, those are basically your 3 options for species. What do you think humans will do in response to a change? What do you think we'll do first, and what do you think will happen in the long term? Like, say, if we have nuclear war, okay, and lots of places become unlivable because of the radiation. What do you think we'll do first? What will happen? Here's our dinosaur. Yes, we don't know what dinosaurs looked like exactly, but here's a pretty decent artist's rendition, and it looks like volcanoes going off in the background. Okay. Today we believe that really it was a giant asteroid that hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs, not a massive volcanic eruption or anything of that sort, but something that blocked out the sky for many months and killed all the plants, and then when all the plants died, everything else dies. Beyond mass extinctions, a certain number of species will just go extinct on their own because they failed to adapt, or they failed to reproduce, or both. And this is called background extinction. And every day a species goes extinct just from background extinction, not because humans caused it, not because nature caused, well, nature did cause it, but I guess through no fault of humans or anything artificial. It just went extinct. Mass extinction is when there's a significant rise in background extinction, or in extinction above background extinction, so dinosaurs. And there was also another extinction before that that wiped out almost all the things in the oceans and that sort of stuff. So how do we create new ones? Well, same sort of thing. You've got eventually, maybe the original species is able to survive, but this new species has adapted, and over time it breaks off on its own. And so now you have these two different species, the original species and the one that has adapted to some new change and is better able to survive under those conditions. So here's a good example. If you've got the ancestral fox way back, some went north and some went south. Okay, those that went south did not develop thick fur. They stayed kind of a brown gray, had big ears in order to radiate heat, very quick to evade larger predators, that sort of thing. Whereas those that went north adapted to the cold and maybe don't run as fast because they're not worried about larger predators. Instead, they're more worried about catching prey. So there's an example of speciation. You have different selective pressures on an ancestral organism, which has allowed it to split into two separate things. The Galapagos finches are another great example. These are what Darwin studied and what gave him his evidence for the theory of evolution, which has been backed up by other examples of this. So, if you look at the Galapagos Islands off of South America, you'll find that there was an ancestral finch that lived there a long, long time ago. And over time, these birds developed different beaks based on their food source. So on the Galapagos, there are insects, there are large nuts, small nuts, seeds, and fruits. And so these species develop different beaks, as you can see, based on the type of food that they best eat. So the original one had kind of an okay beak. It wasn't specialized. It wasn't able to outcompete anything. But then maybe it looks like this one developed here, okay? And this one has a short, narrow beak, so maybe it's better able to get insects out of a tree, okay? And so it can get the insects out of the tree better than the original, so it's going to outcompete it. And then these guys developed all sorts of different beaks, so they've got ones for different types of insects, and these got, small seeds, small nuts, large nuts, so that it can crack them open in different ways. Those sorts of things. So the biodiversity part of this is just the variety. Okay, we've already touched on how you can have a gene pool and you have to have a variety of different genes within a species. But you have to have this balance. And so the creation of species, or speciation, and extinction are in a balance, where you generally create new species at the same rate that something goes extinct. And you can obviously mess with that. So by having one species go extinct, we can create another species that fills a niche. So for example, if we go back up here, if this bird were to go extinct, then maybe one of these other birds will split into two different species in order to fill the role of this other one that went away. However, it is a long-term process. You must not forget that it takes a very, very, very long time for speciation to occur. So, how do they survive? Alright, let's look at a case study here, the giant panda. If you have a rapid change to the environment, like humans come in and cut down the forest, okay, most likely it leads to extinction, okay? No species can adapt overnight. They take a long time. And cutting down an entire forest is artificial. That is not something that has happened at any point in a species' history. So there are no genes to cope with that. There is no such thing as a panda that can just all of a sudden be like, oh, all my food is gone. Let me start eating dirt. There's not, and they won't survive. There's no gene that allows them to digest dirt. Okay, so as a result, they would probably go extinct. However, if you have a slow change to the environment, if you only cut down 1 acre a year, and you cut it down very slowly, if you cut down 1 acre a year of a 10,000 acre forest, that species will adapt. It will survive just fine. Okay, it will eventually be able to change. So that's it. A quick overview of evolution. I hope you remember most of this stuff from biology. There were some vocabulary words in here like microevolution, speciation, adaptation, allele, etc. Please go back, make sure that you know all these. You may see them on tests, quizzes, or exams. Alright, so once again, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.